Would you ever consider voting for a communist government?
Or is it an evil doctrine?
What? How's that even a question? After what we saw the 20th century, you're asking a question like that?
Where you say you're coming from. And I've got to be honest, I still don't get this. What do you call yourself? It's a
fully automated luxury communism.
This one really takes a piss.
That's something which my colleague Aaron Bassani came up with. So the idea about fully automated luxury communism is that because of automation...
Oh no, this argument again. Oh my head.
Is that workers are becoming more and more expendable.
What? How did you even draw to that conclusion? You literally pulled that one right out of thin air.
Research that this does two things which are contradictory. The first thing is that it makes workers more precarious because you've got more unemployed people. It means you can't agitate for wages and conditions. On the other hand, it shows you a glimpse of a possible future of a world where human work isn't necessarily, you don't need it.
Oh my god, man, she actually just says that. She actually means it. Just wow. Just wow. I just, oh my brain. Oh my brain. Surely I'm missing something here. I'm gonna have to do a lot more research on her. This just doesn't add up. Where's she getting all this stuff from? Oh, will you look at here. Owen Jones might have known.
That's supposed to be a big scary word which is associated with the horrors of Stalin and the Gulag, but communism is back, baby, and it's back because Ash Sarkar, a prominent activist and journalist, disclaimer, friend of mine as well, went on national television with Piers Morgan, one of the most odious figures ever existed, and when accused of seeing Barack Obama as a hero, replied,
"He's not my hero, I'm a communist, you idiot!"
Oh, I've heard it all now. Oh my god.
What actually is communism? Can we disassociate it from the horrors of the 20th century? And what about the horrors of capitalism as well?
What? What horrors of capitalism? You mean all the stuff that your socialism caused, such as the wars and the booms and bust cycles, that you try to project off onto capitalism because of what your socialism caused?
So imagine like a semicolon in the middle, and that's my way of
doing
getting
a lot
around
of
the
work,
nonsense.
the semicolon, I can tell.
I have to see literature graduate, man. I love a semicolon. Communism is a belief in the power of people to organise their lives as individuals, their social lives.
What are you going on about? You're going on about this today with individuals? As if to say individuals just go and do their own thing? That's all well said and done, but have you got any historical examples of that? How you doing, folk? Scotty. So I just obviously looked up this Ash Sarkar I was requested to. Ash Sarkar, I see obviously is heavily into this communism, and then I realised that somebody else had made a request for me to look at Novara Media or something. That's something I will get around to as well. This Ash Sarkar completely blows your mind.
Would you ever consider voting for a communist government?
No, you honestly think somebody with a brain would honestly vote for socialism? That's right, I said socialism. I never say communism. I just say socialism because that is where socialism leads. It's all well thinking you could ignore economic reality, but when you go to put it in practice and you try to, defy the study of economics, you're only going in one direction. This Ash Sarkar, she goes on about this utter nonsense about the private sector and individuals. And again, let's just listen to what she says on her description of what communism is.
Communism is a belief in the power of people to organise their lives as individuals, their social lives, their political and their economic lives, without being managed by a state.
Folk like Ash Sarkar haven't got a clue what communism is, in other words socialism. They don't even understand the first thing to do with collectivism, with collective ownership of the means of production. All of them try to, correlate and bastardise socialism, and they even try to correlate socialism with decentralisation. The word socialism, what does it mean when you're socialising property? What does it mean when you socialise medicine? Your universal healthcare means you're collectivising it. Collectivise is to centralise. That isn't decentralisation. It's not even an if, it's not a but, it's not a maybe. Socialism is defined by political centralisation. It's one of the biggest parts of what defines socialism, because you're taking it out the hands of private individuals. You're taking it away from personal ownership. A libertarian socialist is an oxymoron, because the bottom line is, if you take away from the private individual, you're stripping the individual of their rights and their liberty, because you're taking away from them their liberty to owning their own possessions and their own property. Like I say, and I have to repeat this, the main reason for why communal ownership led to starvation was because the individuals never had the freedom to work for the fruits of their own labour. In translation, they never got to keep their own possessions. That was the whole reason why they were dying of starvation.
And private property is a barrier to the distribution of those resources that we need to not just survive but thrive, and not a facilitator of it.
She thinks that private property is the barrier to allocating resources and creating wealth. When you use a welfare state through socialism to forcibly remove from one individual or to another, you're not creating wealth, right? That's no multiplication. All you did was you took from Pete to pay to Paul. The point being is the fact that you're dividing. You cannot multiply wealth by division. That's why Margaret Thatcher says the problem with socialism is you'll eventually run out of other people's money, because that's all you're doing with socialism. That is the very reason why India ended up in the extreme poverty that it did. It had nothing to do with Great Britain. Great Britain left in 1947. India gained independence in 1947. So the reason why India for 5 straight decades was in extreme poverty was because of socialism, and what they did was they shut off trade to the outside world. So if there's no trade coming in and out of the country, then how are they going to get about? Well, that's it. All you're left with is the money that's already left, the wealth that's already there. Eventually you run out and everybody ends up in extreme poverty, and unfortunately as it is to say, throughout that entire time period, India was living in extreme poverty. They used up 70%, as I says in the previous video, 70% of their natural resources. Why did I use this example? If they try to turn around and say to you, oh, this was just the fault of Great Britain, really? Well, that's quite interesting, that, because Hong Kong was under British rule. Although the British government was extremely limited to what it could do in Hong Kong, it doesn't change the fact, unlike India, that had vast arable land and India had vast natural resources, they used up 70% of their natural resources. Yet there was Hong Kong. Well, it was once a tiny small fishing village, equivalent to the poverty of Cambodia. In 1948, they had an average household income less than $200. Despite having no natural resources, Hong Kong went on to become the richest city in the world and lifted the masses out of poverty. You know, the mid-1990s sitting around $16,000 to about $20,000 for an average household income. Whereas a country that was living under socialism with vast arable land and natural resources, India was living in extreme poverty throughout that entire time period. Now, the reason why I used the example there is because she's banging off about, resource allocation, because your supercomputers are not going to be able to achieve it. It doesn't matter whether you argue for a moneyless based economy or you argue for socialism, basically what it typically is, controlling prices. The reason why I reiterate so often about the economic calculation problem is because it is the primary reason for why socialism cannot be democratic or libertarian, for why it leads on the road of totalitarianism, and the very reason why you end up down the road such a catastrophe where resources are overused, misallocated, etc, etc. That is to say, there's nothing in the entire study of economics more important than that of the information of prices, because prices are not obstacles to getting things that you want. Prices are signals. If you've not got the information of profits and losses, how are you supposed to technologically advance? How are you supposed to do anything? Well, she's going on about this of automation again. Again, you can go and watch my video on automation. I'm not going to all that again.
The first thing is that it makes workers more precarious because you've got more unemployed people. It means you can't agitate for wages and conditions.
Again, folk, there's a lot of contradiction in what she says, and she starts going on about wages. So this implies that she's now speaking about people having wages. But then she confuses me. She starts going on about people will need work. You see, these socialists are all over the place. One minute they're talking about, oh, let's have fully automated communism, which communism in theory, by the way, basically means you have a moneyless based economy. But then they start contradicting themselves and they start going on about wages. They can't make their mind up. The reason why they can't make their mind up is because they don't even know what it is to start with. They don't even understand the theory of communism, never let alone that of how it turns out in practice. But she also says this.
But on the other hand, it shows you a glimpse of a possible future of a world where human work isn't necessarily, you don't need it in order to generate abundance that we can all benefit from.
Folk, go and watch my video on the economic calculation problem. Get to understand the whole thing today with that of scarcity. This is something that socialists, they don't live in the real world. They don't understand the fact that your land is scarce. Housing is scarce. In other words, it's not just a case that you can just have an open door policy, as if to say placements such as education or healthcare or whatever it is. It's not a case that it's unlimited. You can just flood as many people in as you want, and you can just completely ignore the laws of supply and demand, and that's exactly what people like her are doing. And they're speaking about resources as if it's infinite. I've stated this before and I'll say it again. See, if resources were infinite, there would be no requirement for the study of economics. She doesn't understand the fact that economics is a study of trade-offs. She thinks it's just a case you can just do whatever you like, and that's it.
You might have heard from Nigel Farage and his merry band of reactionaries that the country is in grave peril. No, not from that. It's from migrants crossing the channel in rubber dinghies you'd consider too flimsy for pootling around Shadwell Basin, let alone navigating the world's busiest shipping channel while carrying women and children. In contrast to the government's hostile environment for migrants, the media has fostered a much more hospitable one when it comes to super dumb opinions about migration. Because there's no context, images of brown men in small boats are, no pun intended, floating signifiers. They're seen through the lens of much of the prejudiced, dishonest, and alarming coverage which you find in right-wing print and political media. Journalists are failing in their duty to separate fact from popular feeling. The plight of migrants at sea has already been reduced to far-right talking points determined by Nigel Farage and given governmental legitimacy by Priti Patel. Myths like the UK is uniquely burdened with refugees because other countries are failing to take on their fair share.
So you've got the gist of it, folk. She's going on about the immigration and then try to call it a myth and everything. It's nothing at all to do with the skin colour of anybody. And forget the point that you could go on about, oh well, we need skilled workers and all the rest of this. The main issue is to do with an economy. You cannot ignore the laws of supply and demand. When it comes down to that of housing, everything to do with healthcare, education, there's a legitimate argument that folk have had that you're letting specific dangerous people into this country, regardless of whether you believe it's done through that of a government or you want decentralised immigration control. I think it's sensible that you have a control over immigration. People like her have no got a clue about the laws of supply and demand. They think it's just something you could just brush aside and it doesn't matter.
This is, I think, a really damaging trend in our public discourse, which is if you criticise the way that Britain has been run by elites, the outrages that have committed in our name, you are cast somehow as a Britain hater, rather than someone who wants our country to be run better in a more just way, in a more egalitarian way.
I despise that word, folk. I can't stand it. This idea of egalitarianism. Equality stood for equal opportunity, and that was it. What these communists have done, they've turned everything into egalitarianism. How do you do that without forcing your will upon everybody else to try and create that so-called egalitarianism? And even if that person is better than you, is more skilled and works harder than you, you're going to force them to work for the same wage as you. So this idea of just wanting a just society and this egalitarianism, etc., it's all nonsense. Because folk like you, who have never, ever touched an economics textbook in your life, you've never studied prices, you couldn't even tell folk about price shortages, why it's created through price ceilings, anything at all about where money comes from. You just go on about this theoretical fantasy world. We'll just do this and we'll have a moneyless based economy and everything will all be okay. We don't need money. We don't need prices. What's that for? We'll be fine without prices. We can allocate resources. We'll know all that information. No, you don't. That tells you you've never studied economics. And it's the same thing with the same argument I've heard before. And somebody says humanity is more important than economics. Jesus Christ, man. Yeah, okay. You tell yourself that. It's like saying that, you know, you could do whatever you like in the economy and you'd face no consequences for your actions. Well, that just isn't the real world.
And the reason why I think Jeremy Corbyn most certainly doesn't hate Britain is because I listened to him at a talk just the other week and watched him celebrate the history of the abolition of slavery, the trade union movement, the Chartists. That's not someone who hates British history or tradition.
You're honestly having a laugh. Your trade unions absolutely ripped the arse right out the British economy. They were dictatorial. That's the reason why Margaret Thatcher stepped in and booted the trade union congress right in the teeth. In fact, by doing so, she ended up creating 3 million plus jobs. They were that totalitarian. Trade union congress blackmailed non-union members and says to them, you're not going to find work with us, with any industry we're involved with, if you don't become a union member. That's totalitarian and you think that's alright? Then you go on about how Jeremy Corbyn, the one who sympathises with the likes of Hamas and he sympathises with all the terrorists, the same Labour Party that spat right in the face of democracy, and you're telling us that you don't hate Britain. And now we see of recent the BBC, typical left-wing BBC, is wanting to do away with Rule Britannia or anything makes British people proud to be British. It doesn't matter what you think of the context to the song Rule Britannia. I'm not saying that I'm proud of stuff to do with the imperialism or colonialism of the past. You show me a place in this world that's been absolutely spotless. You could go through all the empires throughout, you know, the world's history, such as the Roman Empire, etc. Does that mean that I should look at Italy and scorn, you know, and stick my nose up at Italy? There's many things that Britain's done that we can be very proud of. And fair enough, Jeremy Corbyn goes on about the slavery. So what? He supports socialism. That is slavery.
What are we talking about?
It's a world without scarcity, and it's saying that just because a robot's taken your job, it doesn't mean that you can't feed yourself, you can't feed your family, or you can't home yourself.
But where does the money come from?
So what it's saying is that instead of that money being kept by a few tiny elites, it's distributed amongst the people that generate that value.
So
what's she going on about now? Now she's contradicting the entire theory of communism being moneyless. She's not even got a clue all about Karl Marx said this and Karl Marx said that. The theory of communism is moneyless, classless and stateless. That's the theory of communism. So obviously you've never read and understood communism to begin with. She's now conceded to the fact that she supports money. Number one, you've conceded to the fact that you want money. Money can only come from either two places. One, the private sector, or two, the printing press. The printing press inevitably, without even a question, not even an if, a but, or a maybe, printing press leads you right in the road towards hyperinflation. She doesn't understand a single thing to do with economics and she expects people to take her seriously. Red Hood goes on to mention capitalist towns cannot exist in a socialist society, while socialist communes can exist voluntarily in a capitalist society. See, one of the things that a lot of folk don't understand about that of individualism, you have individuals that have the freedom to choose whether they go and work in a collective group or not. Of course, like you said, you could have these individual communes if they, freely wish to. Whereas when you live under socialism, it forces its will upon everybody else, takes away individual ownership. That means all personal ownership. Takes away private ownership and it leaves you destitute. Pee-wee goes on to say the argument of not having a choice but to participate in a capitalist society can be also used against socialism, because in socialism every land is collectively owned, meaning that you have no choice but to participate in the collective. PB is absolutely spot on. The other thing to note is the fact that it's not just a case that it's all collectively owned, it's a case that they end up building walls and that. They can't have folk leaving their country. The reason why in such regimes like that of East Germany, or why they had to build the Berlin Wall, why you had the Iron Curtain, etc., when you've got people working in communal ownership under these socialist regimes, and let's say one individual is putting in all that hard work and then he decides to just give in and pack up and wants to leave the country, how that's actually viewed as, it's viewed as treacherous. This person is then viewed as a traitor. The reason why he's viewed as a traitor is because the fact that the work that he's doing is doing for every other person, and since he stops that work, then he's a traitor. He should be punished for doing so, and that's the very reason why you can't leave these socialist countries. Backwards Man 95 goes on to say you need to compare actual capitalism with actual socialism and ideal capitalism with ideal socialism. You rightly mock ideal socialism as not translating to reality, but then you can't put up the real version with a real free market. I've got historical examples to show where the market was far better off. The 19th century, for example, in the United States of America, you would say, well, it wasn't exactly fully free market. You're right in saying that yes, there was periods of government's intervention. If you look at between 1794 to about 1845 with the private turnpike industry, in the absence of government's subsidies, the market was far better off. Yet when government intervened in the 1860s through Abraham Lincoln, once he began the internal improvements, the corporate subsidies, it basically resulted in that of bankruptcy. Roads were left unfinished because of government. They started building roads through people's own private farmland without their consent, etc, etc, resulting in bankruptcy. You have to look at periods, because nothing's black and white. You have to look at parts of the market where it was left be, and then compare it to what happened when government interfered in the market. And in the real world, the free markets, well, they've performed far better off than any of the mixed economies or that of just socialism in general. If you've got anything you would like to add yourself, comment in the comment section below. Of course, I'll be sure to get back to you. Be sure to like the video, share the video, and of course, it's been quite interesting. Like I say, thank you for watching. I shall talk to you later. Cheers.